I've seen you do a lot of awful things. That, for me, would be high on the list of hard things to do, I would say.
If you could sum up the entire global economy through a geopolitical lens for me, vis-a-vis the hopes and dreams of the average consumer, that'd be great. Do you think that question was better than my Sisyphus?
Your questions are
analogy?
all. I think I was talking to Chuck about this earlier. That I'm so impressed by your intellectual horsepower. It's got me.
It's
stunned.
truly shocking.
It's shocking.
And I had some choice things to say.
Yeah.
It's
really
in response.
Yeah, it's awe-inspiring, maybe.
Hello, friends. What you got here is another episode of The Way I Heard It, specifically number 303. It's called The Incredible Symphony of Things. And at the risk of destroying what's left of my credibility, Chuck, I'm going to go ahead and say that this is my favorite conversation so far.
Well, let me tell you, as I said to you after we were done recording it, that it felt like a 2-hour podcast in an hour and 10 minutes.
Yeah.
It's dense. It's full of information and passion, too. There's a lot of passion in this discussion.
You know, it just occurred to me that my mom's last episode was really enjoyable, too. I really like that one a lot, too. But this guy, Bayard Winthrop, is right up there with my mother. Bayard... true story, sent me a sweatshirt in the mail 12 years ago. His company is called American Giant, and he left a career in finance and decided that he wanted to make clothing, not just in this country, but he wanted to make it entirely in this country, which just doesn't happen much anymore.
Yeah.
Every element of the supply chain is in his control. All through the Carolinas, from the cotton to the zippers to the buttons to everything. He makes the greatest hoodie ever made, according to Slate magazine, who wrote an article with that title about the same time, 12 years ago. Yeah. And he has taken the reverse commute ever since. No real marketing to speak of. No retail outlets until very recently. I think they have some small stores here and there. Mm-hmm. But by and large, he just got rid of everything that consumers don't care about and committed to making the very best product he could make entirely in this country. And unlike so many other people who have vowed to do the same thing, he is not out of business. In fact, he is he's struggling to keep up with demand. And that's pretty great.
It is great. And to hear him talk about it, he speaks so passionately about it. I know he started in finance, but now his love is clothing. He loves making clothing and he loves doing it here. He seems like a real patriot to me. I mean, last week, I was telling you before, we did the test just for the equipment test. And in talking to this guy, we had a conversation for like 45 minutes and I didn't want it to end. You know, it's a 10-minute equipment test, and we were engaged in a global conversation that was about the supply chain and China and everything. It was just fantastic.
Well, clearly he'll talk to anybody.
and he did, because he's so passionate, Mike.
No, and he does. Here's why I like him. He'll go on Glenn Beck for an hour, and then he'll go on MSNBC. He'll go on PBS, NPR, and Fox News. He doesn't care. In that regard, he and I are the same person.
Yes.
We really don't care much about the politics or the platform. We care about the audience.
Right.
And he's on a mission, this guy. And he set the standard really high. And, I mean, I'll tell him and you'll hear it in the conversation. I laughed when I got the sweatshirt 12 years ago and I learned that some guy with a background in finance was going to try and launch a textile company and make everything in this country. Good luck, I said. You poor bastard, it'll never work. Well, he did it. He did it and he's doing it. The company is American Giant. My guest is Bayard Winthrop. The Incredible Symphony of Things is just a little phrase he utters in the midst of this conversation, and it refers to the incredible complexity that the supply chain really is, and what a beautiful noise it can make when all the instruments work together. You're going to like this guy. I guarantee it. As we start, I need to show you something. I found this in my photos.
Oh, that's
me
awesome.
about a year ago holding a giant catfish that I pulled out of the Mississippi River while I was filming a segment for Dirty Jobs that involved caviar harvesting in the Mississippi.
No kidding.
And I'm showing this to you because I'm wearing the sweatshirt that
I
you
see
sent
it.
me out of the blue 12 years ago.
That's crazy, Mike. So I'm actually, that's awesome, and I really appreciate that. I'm more interested in the catfish you're holding. Did you pull that out with your hands? Did you pull that out with your hands?
No, but on Dirty Jobs, in the pilot episode, 2002, we catfish noodled outside of Shawnee, Oklahoma. Now, you hadn't started American Giant yet. I didn't have my favorite sweatshirt yet, and nor did I have gloves. But yes, with my bare manly hand, I pulled out a catfish with a couple of good-natured hillbillies.
I gotta
named
tell you,
Don and Jerry.
I've seen you do a lot of awful things. That for me would be high on the list of hard things to do, I would say.
Well, it's a very primitive form of fishing, obviously, but the idea that a catfish is going to chomp down on your hand is off-putting. But what's truly off-putting is not knowing what
Right.
else is under the rock.
Right.
So it could be a snapping turtle, it could be a rattlesnake, a copperhead. There are like 1,000 ways to die catfish noodling. Don't do it, Bayard. But that sweatshirt, not to belabor the point, has been bespeckled with feces from every species, sperm from all creatures, great and small, that we've violated over the years on Dirty Jobs, and most recently, caviar roe.
We
from
should have
Mississippi.
we should have lined you up for the initial needs assessment for that sweatshirt. Sperm, feces. Those were
You
not on
want to
the
see how
list.
durable it is? Yeah, give it to Mike Rowe.
They were not on the list, but I am glad to hear that they stood up to the task. That's awesome.
So, Chuck and I bragged about you shamelessly in the preamble. You may assume that you've been properly introduced. What I want to do, really, with the hour or so. How much time do you have, by the way?
I've got as much time as you need.
Oh, that's dangerous.
You're going to want to rethink that.
I really do that, Mike. So take your time and when you feel right. But I've my kids are on. I was just saying this to Chuck. My kids are on winter break, and so I gleefully have a day off from them as I left them up in the mountains for a day. So I'm not heading back till this afternoon. So I've got a clear schedule. So do as you like.
Well, Chuck, that's our title. Jot that down. I left the kids up in the mountains. So let's talk as long as you want. Now, I'll try and get you out of here in an hour, but all I really want to discuss is the secret to American manufacturing, the various pitfalls that you've had to navigate in your long and winding road, and why in the world it is you're doing what you're doing, which, again, to somewhat repeat myself, is making clothes in these United States from stem to stern. Every single thing on that sweatshirt you sent me out of the blue 12 years ago, and every single thing on every garment that you're making right now is a reflection of a supply chain that you control. I'm honestly gobsmacked that you pulled it off. 12 years ago, when I heard your story, I laughed because, you know, the movie, Sometimes a Great Notion. I loved the idea of what you were going to try and do. I can't frickin' believe you did it. So I guess the first question is, how's it going?
You know, it's funny. One of the, I similarly, when I started the company, I had, I don't know if it's pessimism, but certainly a healthy dose of how hard it was going to be. I'm not sure I appreciated it as thoroughly in the beginning. I was told by a lot of people in the industry that it couldn't be done. But I think the one thing we had going for us when we started is that we decided that we were going to make it entirely in the United States. And so that kind of put us into a box. And once you're inside that box, you sort of have to figure out, okay, now how are we going to make it work given that constraint? And those early, I don't know, maybe 18 months was an awful lot of just bouncing around the southeastern United States and meeting people. And little by little, as you do that, what you discover that probably should not have been a surprise is that there is still this incredible manufacturing capability within textiles, obviously across the U.S., outside of textiles as well, but within textiles. And this kind of magical thing that began to happen early on where It took a bit of convincing, I think, early on to get
Hmm.
people on board with what I was trying to do. But once they did and decided they wanted to be a part of it, there was this amazing collaboration of talent and skills that made the process pretty easy. And I think the other piece of it, which hopefully that sweatshirt that you have 12 years later is still holding up as well as we intend it to. But when you put a quality marker up there in front of people that you begin to get to know and work with on a regular basis, the quality piece of it falls into place really well too. And so
Yeah.
it's going well. It's not to say that we don't run into challenges, and the government is not making it any easier with its trade posture, oftentimes as it relates to other countries where we allow people to manufacture in. But it's been the journey of a lifetime, and it's going. Now we're making jeans and flannel shirts and jackets and all that within the U.S. So that's a victory of its own, I guess. So it's going as well as we could have expected.
It took a bit of convincing. That's a classic understatement. I love it. Um, you also said that you put yourself in a box, and I'm curious if you think, paradoxically, perhaps that sometimes our desire to think as freely as possible, and our hope to be able to create it in as unfettered a way as possible. I wonder if those things sometimes become our enemies, and if sometimes actually being in a box, a place where you've got parameters, where you've given yourself, whether it's a deadline, real or imagined, or just parameters, lines
Yep.
in the sand,
Yep.
has that helped you over this decade?
I think about that all the time. I mean, to me, the answer is a definite yes. I'll give you just an example. When we got started, we sort of had this idea, pretty naive at the time, I think, that we were going to make a really beautiful sweatshirt, that we were going to pour our soul into it, and we are going to make it in the U.S., kind of consistent with a set of ideals that I value a ton, and that customers would pick up on that, and word of mouth would drive us forward. We really had no marketing budget at all. And in those early days, we had some press that began to pick up on our story, and we had an article written at the end of our first year that called the sweatshirt that I sent you the greatest hoodie ever made. And that
Slate.
in Slate magazine, that's right, by a great reporter named Farhad Manjoo, who's gone on to better things and is, I think he's now an editorial writer at the New York Times. But he wrote that article, and it was a really an incredible moment for us that put us into a demand situation that we couldn't meet for a long, long time. But in the middle of all that, you can imagine, as we were really trying to meet orders and try to fill customer demand for that sweatshirt, we were oftentimes thinking, boy, we could make a phone call and go to Shenzhen or Guangzhou and have tens of thousands of sweatshirts on a boat in no time. But I think by that initial kind of construct, that didn't come to mind. We didn't think about that. It allowed us to stay true to who we were. And in an apparel world that is so filled with so many brands that are competing in so many different ways, to have a clarity of our positioning about this is who we are, and we're committed to a certain way of doing things, has served us really well over the long haul. And so that constraint, I think, has been, it's forced us to invest in manufacturing innovation and manufacturing engineering and relationship building with all of our suppliers. And all of those things over time have just built a momentum that I don't think we would have had the courage and conviction to stick to had we not made that kind of initial, commitment, that decision to stay totally domestic. So
Before we get to the supply chain part of it, which is just so relevant and so on my mind, I want to ask you about brands in general, because I'm guessing you and I are probably the same age or close to it.
yep,
We came up in the 70s, right? Where, I mean, brands were so different. They were so well branded. Levi's meant something. Wrangler meant something else, entirely different.
totally.
Corduroy meant
Red Wing.
something.
Yep,
Right, Red Wing, right.
yep,
And
yep.
so I think around that same time, from what I've read anyway, something like 95% of the textiles that we were wearing as Americans were made in America, and 5% were being imported. And today those numbers are essentially reversed,
That's right.
right? And brands don't mean what I thought they used to mean. And here you are, still in this fight, basically ignoring every bit of savvy marketing counsel I've ever read, and ignoring everything I thought I knew about retail. I mean, you don't even have stores.
Well, we've got a few stores, but Mike, what you're talking about there about the resonance of brands early on was fundamental to the decision to start the company. I mean, I'm sure we are very close to the same age, and I remember really clearly when I wore my first pair of Levi's and thinking that it said something about me, that it reflected something about who I was, and I feel that way about the first flannel I wore from Woolrich, all these things that were imbued with not only a quality that I felt would just last over time, get better with age, but also a brand that I thought reflected something fundamentally the
In
things I
you.
value, yeah, and that I valued about, and so you're exactly right about the statistic. It's almost entirely flipped. About 5%, a little less than that actually, of the clothes that Americans buy today are made domestically. And the situation's a little worse than that actually, because the amount of, just to bury you in some statistics for a second, when we were kids, the average American family spent about $1,600 on clothing and shoes per family. And today, in today's dollars, and today, the average American family spends about the same for shoes
Mhm.
and clothing. But it represents about 3 times the number of items, and the average American family throws away about 80 pounds of clothing a year. And so there's
Good
been this
God.
structural shift towards
Wow.
just poor quality stuff to more disposable stuff. And that was in the back of my mind too. I'm sure it is for all of us, right? We all have this innate sense about the quality paradigm has declined over time. That the stuff
Yeah.
we're buying is just kind of fallen apart. And so, maybe it was marketing stupidity, or maybe it was just a clarity about if we offered consumers really high quality and a set of values that they could count on and know that we weren't going to get caught up into some horrible thing happening overseas, that at least some segment of the customer base would really care about that. So in some ways it relieved for us this mad, digital marketing, Facebook, Twitter, all this craziness that's going on about spending to get customers to buy your product, and allowed us to maybe be more committed to just a set of behaviors and quality commitments that we really valued.
Well, it's back to the box. You put
It's back to the
yourself
box.
in a box that really didn't afford you the opportunity to indulge that kind of a question without stepping all over your, what do the ad guys call it? Your single-minded proposition,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
To
I thought you were
build
going to
in
say
fear.
something else.
But to step on one's John Thomas, as it were. I mean, look, so many of us become. That's why titles. I'm fascinated by titles, and I'm fascinated, even though I don't really like them. I'm fascinated by mission statements
Mm-hmm.
because just the mere act of making one, it kind of forces you to go to whatever the next step is. And I'll give you a really odd example about what you just said. I think when you ask most people about their relationship with quality and their desire for it, it's going to go right to the top,
Yep.
But on Dirty Jobs, something happened to me. And look, and I'm a guy who collected and hoarded Champion sweatshirts.
Mhm.
I love the reverse weave.
Yeah, with good reason.
And you know what? Tell me, I know I'm not the only guy. Every girlfriend I've ever had has stolen every Champion sweatshirt I've ever owned.
Yep.
They just take them. They can't
Yep.
help it. And so Dirty Job starts, and all of a sudden, for the first time in my life, I have a front row seat to a truly disposable
Mhm.
transactional relationship with garments,
Mhm.
right? And it took a minute to accept it, but once I did, it was oddly freeing.
Hmm.
And I'm not trying to suggest that there's any substitute for quality. There's not. But when you work on a show like that, you leave the clothes you wore behind in the Motel 6, usually in a bathtub,
Mhm.
with a note of apology to the maid and $20, right? And I honestly don't know what I would have done had I came into possession of this sweatshirt that you were making. I don't think I could have worn it because I couldn't have.
Yeah.
I couldn't have stood to throw it out,
Yeah.
and I couldn't have bared to keep it.
Yeah. Well, it's a great sort of framing of all the ways that you can define quality. I mean, there is
Right.
a fundamental role for really basic stuff that needs to be darn close to disposable, stuff that you can really trash. I sort of give the analogy of kind of a working pair of of boots and a pair of dress boots. There's the boots that you need to trash every day, and then there's the boots that you wear out to dinner or you wear out at night. And I think that we don't make workwear in the way that Dirty Jobs has to confront on a regular basis. We make stuff that's a little bit different than that. That we hope can carry you for a long, long time. We'll get better with age, but it's our garments are expensive. They're not something that you want to buy and trash and climb through a sewer in and then realize you can't kind of carry it forward. So there really is roles throughout, and I think that one of the problems is, I think anyway, is that we have not allowed customers a better choice in the market, and so there isn't really a spectrum of opportunities for quality and sourcing that's obvious to the consumers. And really, at least in my judgment, so much of what's available, even at the higher price points, are just terrible quality. They're not made well. They're made to really kind of degrade in pretty short order. So, but I agree. I think that there's, even I have those things. I feel like when I'm trashing, that I don't want to kind of make them last 10 years. They're only going to last for, maybe 10 days of tough work.
I wish I could sum it up, because it really does feel like there's a gotcha or an unintended consequence to almost every pithy observation that you can make about the global economy and about the relationship between quality and cost, and about, utility versus brand and so forth and so on. There's just no easy way to talk about it. But having said that, if you could sum up the entire global economy through a geopolitical lens for me, vis-a-vis the hopes and dreams of the average consumer, that'd be great. And
I'll,
by
I'll,
that,
I'll tell you my point of view about as it relates to domestic manufacturing. How about if I narrow
okay,
it down to that?
That's a
I
good
think
start.
we've got to and this I think will be close to your heart, Mike. That we've got to allow our domestic manufacturers to compete in a fair way with our international competitors, and we have done a great disservice, I think, in setting up trade agreements that are tilted dramatically against domestic manufacturers. And that is just, if you care about communities and jobs and communities that need them and all those things that underpin a healthy society and a healthy economy, I would
safety.
safety, human rights, minority protections, environmental protections. If you care about those things, I would strongly encourage that you advocate for your elected representatives to pay attention. Thankfully, that is moving a bit more into the conversation at a national level in D.C. But boy, are we doing a real disservice with this.
Uneven playing field.
Yeah, and I think not reconciling so much of the high-minded rhetoric that comes out of D.C. with practical changes in policy that would allow domestic manufacturers to compete evenly in a way that would allow them to really go toe to toe. And I'll just tell you that speaking about the textile industry and all the people that represent the men and women throughout our entire chain, they feel quite confident in their ability to compete if the playing field was level. And so I think
That's it, man.
that's my summation.
Well, and it's not just a great summation. I think it's a really important thing to ponder. I've seen you on Glenn Beck. I've seen you on NPR. I've seen you talk to people way to the left and way to the right.
Mhm.
And I haven't found anyone yet who really pushes back against the idea that the playing field ought to be level. And, we can come at it from consumers, and we can come at it from workers' rights, and we can look at it from a lot of different angles. But if we're going to ask people to make things in this country and at the same time hold them to a standard of care, a duty of care that's wildly disparate with anything that's going on anywhere else in the world, it almost feels to me, and maybe this is a stupid metaphor, but if you had a gifted and talented kid, right? And I'm assuming you probably do, even though you left them up in the mountains. If you took one of your gifted and
They're
talented
smart. They'll
kids
find their way out.
and put them into a public school in a troubled part of any major American city, it feels like that's what we did to our economy. We had a gifted and talented economy when you and I were kids that made 95% of the stuff, right? And we put them out there into this global economy and just said, good luck, and flash forward 40 years. And it seems like a miracle that you made such a great sweatshirt, because what was commonplace 4 decades ago is now nothing short of shocking and
Yeah.
miraculous.
Yeah. I mean, a total optimization for cheap, right? So a whole foreign policy switch towards how do we open up the cheapest means of production we possibly can and sacrifice kind of everything at that altar. I mean, it was sacrifice environmental protections, sacrifice human rights protections, sacrifice domestic capabilities, jobs, and communities. And, I'm sure, Mike, in your travels, as is mine, you go through many, many communities where the jobs are gone. There aren't, and that is, if you care about the country, if you care about your fellow citizens, I would just make a strong plug that a good job is a real gift. It's a real joy, and we've taken that from a lot of communities in ways that may make sense in DC. They may make sense on the Nasdaq or the stock markets. They don't make sense in terms of the things that really matter in these communities. And that is one of the reasons why I'm sure I sent that sweatshirt to you way back when. Was I just found someone with common cause who was just an advocate for good, dignified work, and in all of its forms, and that we have, in my mind anyway, politicians for a long period of time that didn't recognize that or didn't optimize for that. I think they're coming around now. I think there's an awareness in at both sides of the aisle, to your point, that this is an important thing. And as you can imagine, we've got a broad range of customers. I got heat for being on NPR. I got heat for being on Glenn Beck. My basic position is anyone that wants to talk to me about domestic manufacturing and jobs, I'll talk to them all day long. It's an important thing in my mind. I know it is for you as well. And so but it is something that we have to begin to focus on from a policy perspective, because I think so much of what we're seeing now, this discord and this distrust that's happening, can trace its roots down to I think a lack of good opportunity. And so in urban and in rural communities that don't have those jobs that were around in the 70s when we were there. And that's an important conversation for Soul to be having, I think.
All right. Well, we're definitely going to have it, I promise. But I got to go back 12 years ago when I opened the box and pulled out this sweatshirt. There was a note in there, and I read it to my partner, Mary. And I'm like, get a load of this cat, man. He sent me like $100 hoodie. I don't know what you were selling them for back then, but it wasn't cheap. It felt like breathable Kevlar. I'm like, this thing is Jesus. I mean, it's amazing. And his name is Bayard Winthrop, and he sounds like he fell off the Mayflower. And I think he used to work on Wall Street, and now he's trying to make stuff in this country. And so, we laughed, me and Mary, because, I call her Sisyphus and she calls me Quixote. But I'm like, this guy is pushing a boulder up a hill. And anyway, I guess there's no real question in here other than to say Sisyphus never really made it to the top. He just pushed.
Yep.
He made progress, and then it rolled over him, and then he did it again and again and again and again and again.
Yep.
Are you Sisyphus or Quixote?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I care, actually.
It's the real question if you think about it, really, man. I can't believe that came out of me. It's one of the best questions I've ever asked.
I don't know if I care. I mean, I sort of feel like, I'll give you just a really quick background. I did start out working in finance in New York, and wasn't any good at it, wasn't nearly smart enough. And I'd grown up in a sort of a strange dynamic. I was going to New England prep school, but coming home to a home situation is quite different than that. And my mom was dating the local mechanics and tradespeople and making sure that I'm the youngest of three boys, making sure that we could take care of ourselves and work with our hands. And she really valued that, does still. And I gave a shot at working in finance and realized pretty quickly I was ill-suited to that, and then got into businesses that were making things. And what I realized really quickly, I think, was no surprise that there are the things that kind of bond us all together are so much greater than those that separate us, and that we had over time kind of not optimized for these manufacturing jobs. And I myself was sort of part of that process. I was moving the business I was running. I was moving manufacturing overseas. And then it dawned on me one day, and it happened to coincide with the birth of my oldest daughter. She was very young when I started the company, weeks old, actually, maybe a month and a half old. And that I kind of didn't want that to be what my story was, that I was sort of optimizing for 25 cents to make something cheaper, if I shipped it overseas, and then have all those conversations with people that I was pulling my work out of and apologizing. It just all felt kind of gross. And so I sort of, by the time American Giant came around, I was on more of a mission. I just wanted to shine as much of a light on something and do something I knew that I would be proud of. whether it turned out to be a big
That your
business or small
kids would be
business.
proud of.
And that my kids would be proud of. That's right. So I'm not sure I care. The boulder, I'm sure, will continue to roll over all of us repeatedly, right? But I've got enough tenacity and interest in this particular topic. You've got your own version of this, Mike, I'm sure, that I'm going to keep pushing. And I, I'm an eternal optimist. So I'm going to choose to believe that all of us are going to begin to bang the pots and pans loud enough that we begin to tilt things back into favor of the men and women that are working so hard to stay competitive and to stay in jobs and all that kind of good stuff.
Well, again, everything in me wants to try and simplify this, and that's probably naive. But sometimes I think it's got to go splat before it gets better. It being whatever you want to fill in the blank with,
Mm-hmm.
and splat being anything from, a lockdown to a pandemic to a war to an unidentified balloon. Who the hell knows?
Yep. Yep.
I mean, we're just surrounded by so much uncertainty. But what do you think splat means? Like when do we pull our gifted and talented kid back? When do we say, no, it's got to be fair and square. It's got to be even, or we're simply going to take our marbles and go home?
Well, here's my optimistic answer to that. So I think we are, if we're not at splat right now, we're really close. I think if there was any confusion about whether China is a friend, I think that the last 4 years have disabused all of us of that notion.
No kidding.
I think that we, in our lifetime, Mike, from the 95% made domestically to 5% domestic of apparel, the essential bet was we're going to open up China, and in the opening up, China's going to become a partner in the world stage and a force for good. And I think the exact opposite's happened. That we've spent 40 years, kind of a massive wealth transfer to China. China has accelerated massively economically, militarily, and has become a much more intractable foe of ours than it was when we started. And the U.S. has moved in the opposite direction. I think the good news is that D.C. is opening its eyes to this finally. I think Trump kicked it off. Biden has picked it up. I think in this regard, there's been very little difference between those two administrations. And as you hear some of the candidates that are now announcing, domestic manufacturing is front and center in those conversations. And I think there's a growing realization that we are overly dependent on China from a supply chain standpoint, from penicillin to light manufacturing to heavy manufacturing. And we have to decouple. And that decoupling has got to happen across the economic spectrum. And I think the good news, to the point that we're all sort of talking about, is the good paying jobs that are consistent with American values is not a controversial thought. It's a bipartisan thought. And I think that the candidates are understanding that the political center, the bulk of the political center is there. And I think finally consumers are waking up to this too. That I think people just intuitively understand that this has been a bad deal. And we have to begin to tilt things back in favor of putting our money and our trade policy in support of friends and support of people that share our values, our environmental values, our human rights values, our foreign policy values. So I think optimistically, we're darn close to splat. I think that even as recently as this past week, and discussions about what's happening between China and Russia and the alignment of decisions there, I think are going to force all of us, from consumers to policymakers, to confront what we're doing about getting, to your point, investing back in ourselves for a while and making sure that we can get back onto a good footing.
So there's policy and politicians.
Mm-hmm.
There's manufacturers, large and small, and there's consumers. Who do you think needs to be the tip of the spear with regard to turning the ship around?
That's kind of at the core of it, I think. So,
do you think that question was better than my Sisyphus?
Your questions are
analogy?
all. I think I was talking to Chuck about this earlier. That I'm so impressed by your intellectual horsepower. It's got me.
It's
stunned.
truly shocking.
It's
Please
shocking.
continue.
And I had some choice things to say.
Yeah.
It's
really
in response.
Yeah, it's awe-inspiring, maybe. I'm trying to find the right word.
Please. Please.
But I think do we have to ask consumers to be the ones that determine I'm going to pay a premium for X, Y, or Z? That seems like a very large ask. So the participants here are consumers, resellers, brands, and policymakers, at least in the way that I think about it. And I think the consumers are the ones that we should ask the least out of. I think they should be. So let me sort of talk a little bit about that. right now we ask, we say to our biggest brands, you can Instagram about all the things that you purport to care about, all the values you care about, but we're going to wink, wink, nudge, nudge, allow you to go make things overseas in places that have none of those protections, don't care about any of those things, and make much more money as a result and get all your shareholders very, very wealthy. And
Virtue signaling, I believe
virtue
they
signal.
call it.
Yep. And allow people to Instagram about whatever your issue is, whether it's a supporter of pride or supporter of environmental protections or want to protect the planet or care about
Black
minority
Lives
rights.
Matter.
Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. So we allow our biggest brands to virtue signal about that, but then to pursue behaviors that are totally inconsistent with that. And the result is that they're able to make T-shirts for $18, and they make huge margin on those T-shirts, and they get their shareholders very, very wealthy. So I think it starts with policymakers that begin to close the loopholes in trade agreements and allow the domestic producers to be more competitive. But I think that brands and resellers also have a very big role to play. I think the question comes up for brands maybe that we care about, that we think maybe even represent America at its best. They need to find their own moral compass a little bit and begin to put their own. Yeah, Chuck. Are you going to weigh in there?
Oh, well, yeah. I was going to wait till you finish.
Just that they've got to find their own. They've got to find their own moral compass. They've got to determine what they believe. Like, do they care that they operate consistent with their values? And then resellers. Everyone likes to pound on Walmart, but Walmart has actually taken a stand on this issue, and they've made a real commitment to domestic production. And back to the earlier point, this conversation creates strange bedfellows. You might think on the face of it that I would be an anti-Walmart person, but boy, do I value a company like that is taking a stand. And maybe contrast them with Amazon. Let's just pick two big resellers.
Boy, do I have a Walmart story. I'll tell you after Chuck asks his prescient question.
All right, I'd love to hear that.
Well, my question is about the loopholes. You mentioned the loopholes, and I know that you say that it shouldn't fall on the consumer to do the heavy lifting, and government is a part of that. It's like, what are the loopholes now that exist? Because I don't think a lot of people understand or know, and what can be done. What does Congress need to do to close them?
Yeah, that gets into a pretty wonky discussion about trade agreement and trade negotiation. And in fact, Chuck, next week I'm traveling with Ambassador Tai. It'll actually, I think, when this airs, it'll be the week. I think I'll actually be in North Carolina with her representatives going through our supply chain to talk about this exact issue. There are lots and lots of small details about trade agreements, but to make it simple, China can produce goods and have access to the domestic market, the American market, with no penalties at all. If I tried to do that in reverse and tried to sell our products into China, we would be hit with major import duties and tariffs. That's crazy. But before you even talk about anything else, that's crazy. We're giving access to the domestic market, the best market in the world, for free. There's no price of entry. You don't have to do anything effectively. So just closing some of those things and beginning to make it more level about if we're going to import and export, we've got to be doing that with the same flattening of tariffs and duties and import penalties. So there's just a lot of examples like that are buried in these trade agreements. You've got lobbies like the retail lobby that are very aggressively trying to block those things. And so it really is incumbent upon, I think, all of us to make noises about why we are giving China such unfettered access to our market and being so restrictive about their own domestic market. So there's a lot of them there, and I don't know if there's any way to post some links to some interesting reading for some of your listeners, but if there wasn't, I'd be certain to be happy to provide some of them for you to look at.
Sure. We don't we don't have any listeners.
None of, and the two that we do have don't read.
Sorry,
they can't read.
Maybe Chuck could read
God
that.
Bless them.
Chuck could read that.
Chuck will act it all out with a really compelling interpretive dance that we
Pantomime.
find resonates with the core demographic.
Tell me your Walmart story.
Yeah, so I got a call from Walmart, and full disclosure, a year before, maybe two, I had a Dirty Jobs cleaning product on the shelves, and it didn't work out. It was the product was made partly here and partly in Canada, but for a whole lot of reasons that nobody cares about. People love the product, but I just couldn't compete with P&G.
Yep.
But I made some friends at Walmart, and one of them called me and said, "Look, this company is going to commit to spending $250 billion over the next 10 years in the U.S. supply chain. We are going to physically and affirmatively reopen factories in the Rust Belt and other places. And we're deadly serious about it. And we've made this commercial for the Super Bowl, which wound up airing during the Olympics instead, and we'd like you to narrate it.
Eh.
It's basically a commercial called The Factory, and it celebrated the reopening of factories, and it trumpeted Walmart's commitment to spend a lot of jack, right, over a decade. So I did it. And when that commercial aired the next morning, Facebook blew up. People were so pissed off at me, Bayard. They couldn't believe the Dirty Jobs guy would narrate a commercial that was announcing the biggest retailer in the country's commitment to bet on the U.S. supply chain again. They couldn't believe it because they saw Walmart so clearly as an enemy of workers' rights. And I was immediately, and for the first time in my life, quickly put into these requisite boxes. It's incredible.
Wow.
And so I learned a lot of lessons in that moment. I was boycotted, by the way, for somebody called Jobs with Justice. Got 15,000 letters. It was insane.
Wow.
What happened. But it really opened my eyes to the sensitivity and the nuance and just how deeply felt so many opinions were around the business of just being able to afford, you know? I mean, you have millions and millions of people just to ask the shitty question that I'm sure you've had before, right? We can't just make $130 sweatshirts, period. There are a lot of people in this country, there's no way they're going to be able to afford that. So there's Walmart with that solution. And then that's wrapped into this giant, larger problem with China and so forth and so forth.
Yep.
And my God, you know, I just went to bed one night thinking I understood the problem and woke up the next morning having narrated a commercial and seeing my career flash before my eyes.
Yeah, I mean,
they tried to end me.
Yeah, I mean, there's I don't know how to even speak to that. I think there is, you know, there's a purity thing happening out there today that nobody is saying that Walmart is a perfect operator. But if we're going to hold, if we're going to pursue a better tomorrow, we need to recognize when there are people that are willing to make commitments, change behaviors, and boy, that's a clear one. I mean, Walmart's commitment, as you put it, with real dollars. I would invite the people that are up in arms about your support of that decision to point out alternative examples that they think are valuable and valid.
The reason you're here, full disclosure, out of the blue, you sent me the best sweatshirt I've ever worn 12 years ago with no strings attached. Chuck will tell you, you know, it's important to say thanks and return the favor. It just takes a while sometimes. So thank you for your patience. Was there anything you wanted to say that you didn't?
Just maybe take some of this conversation to heart and hope people think a little bit differently about the way they're buying stuff and support your foundation, I guess I'd say. I just appreciate that work because, boy, it makes a difference in these communities that have people that are considering different paths. It's good to have some support there. So that's it.
No,
appreciate being on, Mike, and I'll send you out those jeans.
Sometime 33, I dress to the right. European Husky, if they still make those, used to work for me.
And I'll head over to American-Giant.com and pick up a pair myself. Thanks.
Yeah, you will. 3 easy payments of whatever it takes.
Thanks for the
Stop
plug,
groveling, Chuck. It's unattractive.
Yeah.
Bayard,
right.
Thanks for your time, brother.
I appreciate you
Good
guys
luck.
both. Thanks for having me on. Thank you.
And I sure
Thank
do
you.
hope your kids make it out of the mountains. They sound like nice people.
If you like what you heard,
And even if you don't,
oh, won't you please,
pretty please,
subscribe?
Well, I hate to beg and I hate to plead, but please, pretty freaking please.